Volume 2, Chapter 19 of Rob Roy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott. Volume 2, Chapter 19. Farewell to the land where the clouds love to rest, like the shroud of the dead, on the mountain's cold breast, to the cataract's roar where the eagles reply, and the lake her lone bosom expands to the sky. Our route lay through a dreary yet romantic country, which the distresses of my own mind prevented me from remarking particularly, and which therefore I will not attempt to describe. The lofty peak of Ben Lomond, here the predominant monarch of the mountains, lay on our right hand, and served as a striking landmark. I was not awakened from my apathy until, after a long and toilsome walk, we emerged through a pass in the hills, and Loch Lomond opened before us. I will spare you the attempt to describe what you would hardly comprehend without going to see it. But certainly this noble lake, boasting innumerable beautiful islands, of every varying form and outline which fancy can frame, its northern extremity narrowing until it is lost among dusky and retreating mountains, while, gradually widening as it extends to the southward, it spreads its base around the indentures and promontories of a fair and fertile land, affords one of the most surprising, beautiful, and sublime spectacles in nature. The eastern side, peculiarly rough and rugged, was at the time the chief seat of MacGregor and his clan, to curb whom a small garrison had been stationed in a central position betwixt Loch Lomond and another lake. The extreme strength of the country, however, with the numerous passes, marshes, caverns, and other places of concealment or defence, made the establishment of this little fort seem rather an acknowledgment of the danger, than an effectual means of securing against it. On more than one occasion, as well as on that which I witnessed, the garrison suffered from the adventurous spirit of the outlaw and his followers. These advantages were never sullied by ferocity when he himself was in command, for, equally good-tempered and sagacious, he understood well the danger of incurring unnecessary odium. I learned with pleasure that he had caused the captives of the preceding day to be liberated in safety, and many traits of mercy, and even of generosity, are recorded of this remarkable man on several occasions. A boat waited for us in a creek beneath a huge rock, manned by 4 lusty Highland rowers, and our host took leave of us with great cordiality and even affection. Betwixt him and Mr. Jarvie, indeed, there seemed to exist a degree of mutual regard, which formed a strong contrast to their different occupations and habits. After kissing each other very lovingly, and when they were just in the act of parting, the Bailie, in the fullness of his heart, and with a faltering voice, assured his kinsman, that if ever £100 or 200 would put him in or his family a settled way, he need but just send a line to the Sot Market, and Rob, grasping his basket hilt with one hand, and shaking Mr. Jarvie heartily with the other, protested, that if ever anybody should affront his kinsman, and he would but let him kin, he would stow his lugs out of his head, were he the best man in Glasgow. With these assurances of mutual aid and continued goodwill, we bore away from the shore, and took our course for the southwestern angle of the lake, where it gives birth to the river Leven. Rob Roy remained for some time standing on the rock from beneath which we had departed, conspicuous by his long gun, waving tartans, and the single plume of his cap, which in those days denoted the Highland gentleman and soldier. Although I observe that the present military taste has decorated the Highland bonnet with a quantity of black plumage resembling that which is worn before funerals. At length, as the distance increased between us, we saw him turn and go slowly up the side of the hill, followed by his immediate attendants or bodyguard. We performed our voyage for a long time in silence, interrupted only by the Gaelic chant which one of the rowers sung in low irregular measure, rising occasionally into a wild chorus, in which the others joined. My own thoughts were sad enough, yet I felt something soothing in the magnificent scenery with which I was surrounded, and thought, in the enthusiasm of the moment, that had my faith been that of Rome, I could have consented to live and die a lonely hermit in one of the romantic and beautiful islands amongst which our boat glided. The Bailie had also his speculations, but they were of somewhat a different complexion, as I found when, after about an hour's silence, during which he had been mentally engaged in the calculations necessary, he undertook to prove the possibility of draining the lake, and, giving the plough and harrow many hundred, ay, many 1,000 acres, from whilk no man could get earthly guide anew, unless it were a ged, or a dish of perch now and then. Footnote: a pipe. Amidst the long discussion which he crammed into mine ear against the stomach of my sense, I only remember that it was part of his project to preserve a portion of the lake just deep enough and broad enough for the purposes of water carriage, so that coal barges and gabbards should pass as easily between Dumbarton and Glenfalloch as between Glasgow and Greenock. At length we neared our distant place of landing, adjoining to the ruins of an ancient castle, and just where the lake discharges its superfluous waters into the Leven, there we found Dougal with the horses. The Bailie had formed a plan with respect to the creature, as well upon the draining of the lake, and perhaps in both cases with more regard to the utility man than to the practical possibility of his scheme. "Dougal," he said, "ye are a kindly creature, and hae the sense of feeling of what is due to your betters, and I'm e'en aware of you, Dougal, for it canna be but that in the life ye lead you should get a jeddart cast, ae day sooner or later. I trust, considering my services as a magistrate, and my father the deacon afore me, I have interest enough in the council to gar them wink a wee at a waur fought than yours." Footnote: the memory of Dunbar's legal proceedings at Jedburgh is preserved in the proverbial phrase jeddart justice, which signifies trial after execution. Minstrelsy of the Border, Preface, page 56. "Sae hae been thinking, that if ye will gang back to Glasgow with us, being a strong backlit creature, ye might be employed in the warehouse till something better should cost up." "Nigel muckle obliged to the Bailie's honour," replied Dougal, "but te'll be in her shanks fan the gang's on a causewayed street, unless she'd be drawn up by Gallowgate with toes as she was before." In fact, I afterwards learned that Dougal had originally come to Glasgow as a prisoner, from being concerned in some depredation, but had somehow found such favour in the eyes of the jailor, that, with rather overweening confidence, he had retained in him the service as one of the turnkeys, a task which Dougal had discharged with sufficient fidelity, so far as was known, until overcome by his clannish prejudices on the unexpected appearance of his old leader. Astonished at receiving so round a refusal to so favourable an offer, the Bailie, turning to me, observed, that the creature was a natural born idiot. I testified my own gratitude in a way which Dougal much better relished, by slipping a couple of guineas into his hand. He no sooner felt the touch of the gold, than he sprung twice or thrice from the earth, with the agility of a wild buck, flinging out first one heel and then another, in a manner which would have astonished a French dancing master. He ran to the boatmen to show them the prize, and a small gratuity made them take part of his raptures. He then, to use a favourable expression of the dramatic John Bunyan, went on his way, and I saw him no more. The Bailie and I had mounted our horses, and proceeded on the road to Glasgow. When we had lost the view of the lake and its superb amphitheatre of mountains, I could not help expressing with enthusiasm my sense of its natural beauties, although I was conscious that Mr. Jarvie was very uncongenial spirit to communicate with on such a subject. "Ye are a young gentleman," he replied, "and an Englishman, and a' this may be very fine to you, but for me, why, I'm a plain man, and ken something of the different values of land. I want to get the finest sight we hae seen in the Highlands, for the first keek of the Gorbals of Glasgow, and if I were once there, it sudna been every fool's errand, begging your pardon, Mr. Francis, that should take me out of sight of St. Mungo's steeple again." The honest man had his wish, for, by dint of travelling very late, we arrived at his own house that night, or rather on the succeeding morning. Having seen my worthy fellow traveller safely consigned to the charge of the considerate and officious Mattie, I proceeded to Mrs. Flyter's, in Hull House, even at this unwonted hour. Light was still burning, The door was opened by no less a person than Andrew Fairservice himself, who, upon first sound of my voice, set up a loud shout of joyful recognition, and, without uttering a syllable, ran upstairs toward a parlour on the second floor, from the windows of which the light proceeded. Justly conceiving that he went to announce my return to the anxious Owen, I followed him upon the foot. Owen was not alone. There was another in the apartment. It was my father. The first impulse was to preserve the dignity of his usual equanimity. "Francis, I am glad to see you." The next was to embrace me tenderly. "My dear, dear son." Owen secured one of my hands, and wetted it with his tears, while he joined in congratulating my return. These are scenes which address themselves to the eye and to the heart, rather than to the ear. My old eyelids still moisten at the recollection of our meeting, but your kind and affectionate feelings can well imagine what I should find it impossible to describe. When the tumult of our joy was over, I learnt that my father had arrived from Holland shortly after Owen had set off for Scotland. Determined and rapid in all his movements, he only stopped to provide the means of discharging the obligations incumbent upon his house. By his extensive resources, with funds enlarged and credit fortified, by eminent success in his continental speculation, he easily accomplished what perhaps his absence alone rendered difficult, and set out for Scotland to exact justice from Rashleigh Osbaldistone, as well as to put order to his affairs in that country. My father's arrival in full credit, and with the ample means of supporting his engagements honourably, as well as benefiting his correspondence in future, was a stunning blow to Macvedy and Company, who had conceived his star set for ever. Highly incensed at the use of his confidential clerk and agent had received at their hands, Mr. Osbaldistone refused every tender of apology and accommodation, and, having settled the balance of their account, announced to them that, with all its numerous contingent advantages, that leaf of their ledger was closed for ever. While he enjoyed this triumph over false friends, he was not a little alarmed on my account. Owen, good man, had not supposed it possible that a journey of 50 or 60 miles, which may be made with so much ease and safety in any direction from London, could be attended with any particular danger. But he caught alarm by sympathy from my father, to whom the country and the lawless character of its inhabitants were better known. These apprehensions were raised to agony, when, a few hours before I arrived, Andrew Fairservice made his appearance, with a dismal and exaggerated account of the uncertain state in which he had left me. The nobleman with whose troops he had been a sort of prisoner, had after examination not only dismissed him, but furnished him with the means of returning rapidly to Glasgow, in order to announce to my friends my precarious and unpleasant situation. Andrew was one of those persons who have no objection to the sort of temporary attention and woeful importance which attaches itself to the bearer of bad tidings, and had therefore by no means smoothed down his tale in the telling, especially as the rich London merchant himself proved unexpectedly one of the auditors. He went at great length into an account of the dangers I had escaped, chiefly, as he insinuated, by means of his own experience, exertion, and sagacity. What was to come of me now, when my better angel, in his Andrew's person, was removed from my side, it was, he said, sad and sair to conjecture that the Bailie was nae way better than just nobody at a pinch, or something wur, for he was conceited body, and Andrew hated conceit. But certainly, atween the pistols and the carabines of the troopers, that rapped aff the tane after his t'other as fast as hail, and the dirks and claymores of the Highlanders, and the deep waters and wheels of the Ivanhoe, it was to be thought there would be a poor account of the young gentleman. This statement would have driven Owen to despair, had he been alone and unsupported, but my father's perfect knowledge of mankind enabled him easily to appreciate the character of Andrew, and the real amount of his intelligence. Stripped of all exaggeration, however, it was alarming enough to a parent. He determined to set out in person to obtain my liberty by ransom or negotiation, and was busied with Owen till a late hour, in order to get through some necessary correspondence, and devolve on the latter some business, and thus it chanced that I found them watchers. It was late ere we separated to rest, and too impatient long to endure repose, I was stirring early the next morning. Andrew gave his attendance at my levee, as in duty bound, and instead of the scarecrow figure to which he had been reduced in Aberfoyle, now appeared in the attire of an undertaker, a goodly suit, namely, of the deepest mourning. It was not till after one or two queries, which the rascal affected as long as he could to misunderstand, that I found out he had thought it but decent to put on mourning on account of my inexpressible loss, and as the broker at whose shop he had equipped himself declined to receive the goods again, and as his own garments had been destroyed or carried off in my honour's service, doubtless I and my honourable father, whom Providence had blessed with the means, wouldna suffer a poor lad to sit down with the loss. A stand of cleese a nae great matter to an Osbaldistone, be praised for it, especially to an old and attached servant of the house. As there was something of justice in Andrew's plea of loss at my service, his finesse succeeded, and he came by a good suit of mourning, with a beaver and all things conforming, as the exterior signs of woe for a master who was alive and merry. My father's first care, when he arose, was to visit Mr. Jarvie, for whose kindness he entertained the most grateful sentiments, which he expressed in a few, but manly and nervous terms. He explained the altered state of his affairs, and offered the Bailie, on such terms as could not but be both advantageous and acceptable, that part in his concerns which had been hitherto managed by MacVittie and Company. The Bailie heartily congratulated my father and Owen on the changed posture of their affairs, and, without affecting to disclaim that he had done his best to serve them, when matters looked otherwise, he said, he had only just acted as he would be done by that. As to the extension of their correspondence, he frankly accepted it with thanks. Had MacVittie's folk behaved like honest men, he said, he would ha' liked ill to ha' come by a hint them, and out afore them this gate. But it's otherwise, and they mun in stand the loss. The Bailie then pulled me by the sleeve into a corner, and, after again cordially wishing me joy, proceeded, in rather an embarrassed tone, I would heartily wish, Mr. Francis, that should be as little said as possible about the queer things we saw up yonder away. There is nae good, unless an were judicially examine it, to say anything about that awful job of Morris, and the members of the council wadna think it credible in any other body to be fighting wi' a wee Highlandman, and singing their plaidens, and abune although I am a decent sponsible man, when am on my right end, I canna but think I mun hae made a queer figure without my hat and my periwig, hanging by the middle like bawdrons, or a cloak flung over a cloak pin. Bailie Graham won haeing a count of hair in my neck, and he got that tail by the end. I could not suppress a smile when I recollected the Bailie's situation, although I certainly thought it no laughing matter at the time. The good-natured merchant was a little confused, but smiled also when he shook his head. I see how it is, but say nothing about it, there's a good callant, and charge that long-tongued, conceited, upsetting servant man of yours to say nothing either. I wouldna for ever say muckle even the lassock Meddy can do anything about it. I would never hear an end of it. He was obviously relieved from his impending fears of ridicule, when I told him it was my father's intention to leave Glasgow almost immediately. Indeed, he had now no motive for remaining, since the most valuable part of the papers carried off by Rossley had been recovered. For that portion which he had converted into cash and expended in his own or on political intrigues, there was no mode of recovering it but by a suit at law, which was forthwith commenced, and proceeded, as our law agents assured us, with all deliberate speed. We spent, accordingly, one hospitable day with the Bailie, and took leave of him, as this narrative now does. He continued to grow in wealth, honour, and credit, and actually rose to the highest civic honours in his native city. About 2 years after the period I have mentioned, he tired of his bachelor life, and promoted Mattie from her wheel by the kitchen fire to the upper end of his table, in the character of Mrs. Jarvie. Bailie Graham, the MacVitties, and others, for all men have their enemies, especially in the council of a royal burgh, ridiculed this transformation. But, said Mr. Jarvie, let them say their say, I'll ne'er fash myself, nor lose my liking for sae feckless a matter as a 9 days' clash, My honest father the deacon had a byword, Bent brow and lily skin, a loving heart and leal within, is better than God or gentle kin. Besides, as he always concluded, Mattie was nae ordinary lassock queen. She was akin to the Laird of Limmerfield. Whether it was owing to her descent or her good gifts, I do not presume to decide. But Mattie behaved excellently in her exaltation, and relieved the apprehensions of some of the Bailie's friends, who had deemed his experiment somewhat hazardous. I do not know that there were any other incident of this quiet and useful life worthy of being particularly recorded. End of Volume 2, Chapter 19. Recording by Elliot Miller.